Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our third training course brought to you by 3-Pillar Global, Design Sprints in 60 Minutes, the last of the series, Upskill While You Work From Home. We hope you've been enjoying this series. My name is Rafa Halawi, and I'm the campaign manager at 3-Pillar Global. I wanted to go through some housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted throughout the webinar, but we'd love to hear from you. Please type your questions in the question box on your control panel, and we'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. If we do not get to your question, you will receive an email with the answer in the next day or two. The webinar is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording in the next day or two as well. The slides are available for download through the Handout tab on your control panel. Please feel free to download them at any time. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our presenters for today. Joining us all the way from Romania are Maria Cosma and George Storadek, lead UX designers at 3-Pillar Global. Maria and George, over to you.
Hello, and welcome to our third edition or third episode of our webinar series dedicated to upskilling while working from home, of course. My name is George Serediuc. I'm a lead UX designer here at 3-Pillar Global, and I have Maria Cosma with me, also a lead UX. Maria, hi.
Hi guys. We're joining you from Cluj-Napoca in Romania. It's currently 4 p.m. and it's a beautiful sunny day outside. Hopefully it's the same where all of you are.
Nice. So together we'll share the way in which we adapted design sprint methodology to fit our workflow while building quite different types of digital products. And here's what I mean by different. So today we'll introduce you to the actual design sprint concept. And what we want to do is first showcase how they work on a short-term engagement, and also understand how they change during long-term engagements. And hopefully we will be able somehow to help you connect the design sprints methodology to your day-to-day work. So Rafa, I will ask you to launch our first poll. So what I'll do is put a question on your screen, because trying to get to know our audience, we want to understand on what types of projects do you usually work on. So actually we have two separate questions. The first would be if you ever been part of a design sprint. So you can select one of the following. I'll be selecting yes.
Okay, I think we've gathered most responses.
Okay. Quite a tie over there. And can we also run like the second question as well? We want to understand if you're typically involved in a short-term project or a long-term one. And we will be discussing these two types in a second. Usually we refer to short-term projects as POCs. We define them as proof of concept efforts in which we would quickly define a product. So most of you are working on long-term engagement. Okay, that's really useful for us to know, and I think it will change a little bit the way in which we approach our presentation. So getting back to the slides, to understand the whole concept of design sprints, I think we should first get familiar with the larger concept on which design
George,
sprints
you
are.
might want to reshare your slides. I think we still see the poll for whatever reason.
Do we? Okay, let me just get back to the... So many screens.
It's one of the joys of working from home, right?
I feel the more monitors you have, the more tabs are open.
So are you able to see my screen now?
Not yet.
Let me just...
Yes. Oh, there we go. Nice.
Can you see the design sprint structure one?
I do not yet. If you
How
can go
about
back to it. Yes, now we can see them. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So as I was saying, to understand the whole concept of design sprints, right, we should first get familiar with the larger concept on which these design sprints were built. So I would invite Maria to talk a little bit more about the design thinking process first.
Thanks, Georgie. To understand the whole concept of design sprints, we should first get familiar with the larger concept on which design sprints are actually built, and that's called design thinking. Design thinking is an iterative process. It seeks to understand the users, challenge assumptions, redefine the problems, and bring innovative solutions, send them out into the world to be tested as rapidly as possible. The method, as you can see on the screen, consists of 5 phases: emphasize, define, ideate, prototype, and then test. It's most useful when you want to tackle problems that are ill-defined or unknown. It's a non-linear process. It's considered an outside-of-the-box thinking. It's taught at leading universities across the world. It is encouraged at every level of business. It's not just defined to designing. The design thinking process has become increasingly popular over the past few decades because it was key to the success of many high-profile global organizations and that innovate a lot and depend on these types of agile practices. It's companies such as Google, Apple, and Airbnb. And now I want to give it back to Georgie to dive into the design sprint process.
Yes. So design sprints were first developed at Google Ventures. And it's a really quick way to put in practice the design thinking mindset by mixing it with some business strategy, innovation, and behavior science sometimes. So half of you have been working within a design sprint structure, and working within such a sprint, you can, of course, know that you can almost shortcut those endless debates. You won't actually eliminate them. You would just hold the space in which they would surface and compress sometimes months of discussions into a single week. So instead of waiting to launch a product to see if the idea is any good, you'll get some relevant data from testing a realistic prototype instead. So we can say that you can fast forward into the future to see a finished product, and you could also test the way in which customers would react to that product. Of course, before making any expensive commitments, and that's the most important part. So in here, you can see how the design sprint is spread over the course of 1 week, and each day is dedicated to a specific step in the process. And you can see that in one way it resembles other frameworks that we are usually familiar with, like let's mention SMART objectives or SWOT analysis, right? Now, a traditional design sprint would have this type of organized structure, right? On Monday, the first day, you would commit to a goal together with the whole design sprint participants. You would make a map or choose a target, and then you would dedicate the next day to sketching and defining alternate solutions. The next day would be dedicated to deciding on which would be the best option to go further with. And you would have then a separate day in which you would actually build a realistic prototype to be tested. Of course, prototype that would reflect the agreed upon solutions that you discovered to be most viable. And then you have a dedicated day to actually testing the concept, the prototype, and get some insights if that would either work or not. Now, we asked you about the type of engagement you're currently working on. So usually a design sprint would go hand in hand on a short-term engagement, at least for the types of projects that we work on here at Tripillar. So this is why I'm going to talk a little bit more about the short-term engagements, and Maria will talk more on the long-term ones. And I think the first thing we would need to mention is that we took the essence of the design thinking mindset, right? And that would be practicing an iterative design process. What does that mean? So it means that we run different cycles of work. They would usually be driven by user research. So we would start by either interviewing, testing, observing in general, either the user, the way in which the stakeholders are framing a problem. And then we would take on the ideating phase, in which we would come up with solutions, viable solutions for the identified problems. We would prototype those, and that meaning we would build an interface of those solutions that we could then test. And finally, we would iterate based on the results of those user testings. And we would repeat that multiple times up until we're pretty ready to, we consider that polished enough so that this concept could be implemented. Now, for us, in a short-term engagement, we can say that a design sprint is a shortcut to learning, because we're gaining insights without building or launching any product. We're actually building and validating a prototype. So let me put these up here. So usually a design sprint would first align people towards a common problem, right? And the problem has to be just big enough. It shouldn't be too big. Also, we want to bring everyone's input. Most importantly, we just want to get started. So our motto would be just do it. Because just as important as the outcome is that you're simply starting and getting the train moving. You're tackling a really burning problem. Now, the solution won't be perfect. That's totally fine. That's okay. But the idea is to get something out there that you can then refine and finally get it to a point where it's perfect or close. But the important thing is to get started. Now, we have to mention, I think this is really important, we have to understand that as any tool, as any framework, a design sprint is not a silver bullet that would fix everything. So just as important to see when you can do a design sprint would be to understand when not to do a design sprint. So not everything would need design sprints. If it's a small thing that just needs to get out there, we shouldn't boil the ocean. Or if you have a validated design concept and simply need to implement, you just shouldn't embark on this whole new design sprint process. Also, we shouldn't assume that design sprints would answer all types of problems. So for example, big issues, big epics would need to be broken down, or need a foundation of basic user research to benefit from a design sprint onwards. So if your feature needs fundamental user research, it will take more than a few days, and that would mean a design sprint is not the right approach. So if your scope is large, if your problem has many complex facets, these are not candidates for a design sprint because these problems are too large. So a design sprint can handle a really well-defined problem. It's not an answer for everything, especially big, undefined problems. So in a nutshell, with a design sprint, we can just make sure we're designing the right solution for the right problem. It's almost impossible to design a really good product when you are solving for a problem that does not exist. Also, you can see, you can take an idea and just get it to a validated prototype in a really fast pace. And also you would drill down into what you need to find out in order to take informed product strategy decisions in the future. This would be the summary. Now, if we take a look at the structure, usually, especially in our types of engagements, that is short-term engagements. And when we use the term short-term, we usually refer to a discovery phase in the product development lifecycle in which we are just validating a concept. So in this set of design sprint cycles, we would usually want to have either a product owner or at least a decision maker, right, that would be responsible with communicating the vision and ultimately taking the most important decisions, having the last word, right? A UX designer that would, of course, usually advocate for the user. We would invite a business analyst if they are part of the engagement, because they would sometimes bring a lot of insights when it comes to product strategy, roadmap, business insights, priorities, and so on. And of course, we do have a need to involve the engineering side as well, especially the QA as well, because they would almost always provide additional technical insights that we would oversee. So the Scrum Master would always be at the table, behaving, let's say, like a gatekeeper. Now, this would be a type of team that would participate into a design sprint. Now, in terms of timeline and the way in which we usually structure a discovery project at Tripillar, it would look like this. So it would usually be a project that would take between 4 and 8 weeks. And we would usually start with a discovery sprint. So it won't be a design sprint per se. we would usually want to dedicate a week for understanding the product vision and having a lot of discovery activities like interviews and research in order for us to be prepared to run the actual design sprints. So when you would see an orange block, that would mean we would always invite the client, or not necessarily invite, but it would be almost mandatory for us to involve the client or the key stakeholders. So you can see that we would then run a couple of design sprints, and we have 5 different activities that we would perform during a design sprint. And this would span across a week usually, but we are not defining our design sprints based on weeks, but on working days. So if the problem is smaller, and Maria will talk about this later, you could run a couple of separate activities in the same day and so on. But usually we would stretch it across 1 working week. So in first day, we would distill the findings. So the first thing that we would do is just clarify what we need to do, the problem that we discovered, and so on. So the first day would usually be based on initial research. And then the second day, you can see that where the C is involved, that means client. So in the second day, we would review the findings with the key stakeholders that would participate into a design sprint. And we would make sure we're all on the same page in terms of understanding the problem, understanding what are the options, what would be some viable approaches that we would take on. And then we would want to dedicate 2 days for sketching concepts, or at least building the prototypes. Let's make it clear. So if the first activity would be divergent, that means we would sketch out as many ideas as possible, nothing would be wrong, anything would be possible, and so on. We would just dedicate the second day into a convergent activity. That would mean boiling down the viable solutions, voting, or doing some sort of either affinity mapping, or just having a collaborative activity in which we would drill down on the most promising solutions. And then we would have the last day allocated for testing the concepts that we came up with. And also, this is a day in which we would involve the stakeholders, whether they are the product owners or clients in general, right? And you can see that the next sprint will begin with just distilling the findings that we gathered on the previous one, and so on. And you can see here that we have 2 slightly different types of design sprints. So during this discovery phase, what we'll do is run design sprints and produce a set of concepts. And over time, as we iterate and iterate, our design sprints would actually produce more and more high fidelity prototypes that we would test at the end of each design sprint. So by the time you get to the 8th week, we would actually have a pretty well-defined prototype concept that we would present to our stakeholders via an executive briefing. So the last week of a typical discovery engagement would be reserved for just polishing the design, getting the prototype to be as well-rounded as possible, have an executive briefing, and hopefully come up with a roadmap, a plan that would showcase the way in which this concept can actually be implemented. So I mentioned something about different types of different levels of complexity when it comes to design sprint outcomes. So in the first iterations, we would usually just produce a set of low fidelity sketches, right, that we would test, and we would usually test the overview, let's say user flows, so that when we get to a more detailed view of the user feedback, we will be able to improve and move forward to a set of let's say mid-fidelity prototypes, in which we would have a structure put in place, a visual hierarchy that we would test, and so on. So we run a couple of mid-fidelity testing sessions, and by the time we get to our 5th, 6th, and 7th iteration, we usually have a high fidelity prototype, a prototype that now tests whether or not the font size is, let's say, good enough for the user, really detailed visual hierarchy, other types of components, their padding, spacing, and language as well. So this would be the difference between a really low fidelity sketch that we would test at first and the high fidelity prototype that we would end up with. Now, this would actually be a summary of the tips and tricks that we gathered while working on these short-term engagements. And generally, they're connected to two types of tips. So first, in order to run a really awesome and productive design sprint, you need to make sure you do your research and you're familiar with the industry, client, the problem that you're trying to solve, and the users. Also, for a successful design sprint, you would need to choose the right people that will be there in the workshops, meetings, and so on. So usually we would pick between 5 and 7 key stakeholders, whether that's a C-level decision maker or a product owner, product manager, and so on. A really important thing before running a design sprint would be to make sure everyone is aligned on knowing when will it happen, where, who will participate, and what will you discuss. And I think the most important piece of advice is to manage expectations. So typically, especially for people that were not involved into a design sprint, you will need to make sure they understand they are just validating a direction really quickly rather than creating a full, well-designed product. Also, when it comes to facilitation, these action items have their own category because most of our design sprints are run through distributed teams. So that means for us, video sharing is really important, and having a proper call environment like booking meeting rooms and advising other people to book separate meeting rooms can make a difference. And of course, you're always going to run into tech-related issues, starting with slow internet connection, going forward with low quality equipment, and so on. So you should just keep in mind you have to allocate either time or just double check if everything is okay. And another problem that we faced during remote design sprints was low engagement. So we want everyone to make sure that you are not running really long meetings, 2 hours max, in our opinion. And you would usually deal with a lot of skepticism and people won't be used to dealing with uncertainty. So while facilitating as either designers or product owners, product managers, or product analysts, you need to make sure people understand or are comfortable with uncertainty when it comes to defining problems, voting solutions, and so on. Also, if there's one thing that I would like to get out there, is that if there's a lack of organization, you would have ineffective collaboration. So make sure everything is tight when it comes to schedule, understanding, and managed expectations. And the only thing that I would still need to mention when it comes to short-term engagements is the tools that we use to actually build the prototypes, the designs. For research at the beginning, we're recording through Loopback, and we usually use Trello to track user testing and research in general. And we always use Abstract as a way of keeping things really clear in terms of updates. And Sketch is our main tool for the actual design. For the communication, as a standard, 3PG uses Google services. So we use Google Hangouts and sometimes Slack if needed. And usually Google Drive works really well for us because we have a lot of documents we need to fill in. And the testing also is done based on Marvel prototypes. So that's also a really good tool for us to comment and keep track of updates. So that's pretty much it when it comes to short-term engagements. I'm going to let Maria now talk about long-term engagements and the 3PG design approach when it comes to larger projects.
Thank you, Georgia. I want to share with you some of my learnings from working on long-term engagements that span from 6 months to 2.5 years. I want to share with you some of the characteristics of the design approach on these types of engagements and how we adapted the design sprint to work for us in these contexts. There are multiple types of problems that we need to design a solution for in a long-term engagement. Here at 3Pillar, the team structure usually is composed of a product owner from the client side, one or multiple. We have a product team and we have an engineering team. On a long-term engagement, everyone is working. We work in an agile environment. So there are different types of problems that arise and need to be solved. We can group them in these 3 types: small tasks, known problems, and complex and undefined ones. Each of them have slightly different characteristics. The small tasks have a validated need, a clear solution direction, the execution time is relatively small, and the context for these small tasks could be sometimes urgent. The known problem has a clear goal, is just big enough so it's the best candidate for the design sprint like the one George just presented. Now, the big one, the complex and undefined one. This is usually a general, broad, and vague outcome definition. It has big overarching goals, multiple unknowns, and no very clear solution direction. How we think this all plays out usually in some of the key aspects. There is a roadmap from where we take the design sprint goals. we go through the design sprint process, from where the engineering team takes the designs and builds the solution for the users. But in reality, nothing is linear, nothing resembling anything linear. In the same period of time, when the design sprint is happening, you need to work with the engineering team to aid the implementation through specifications, other clarifications, and other deliverable needs. You design for the upcoming roadmap, but the roadmap is also changing depending on new findings, insights from analysis of how the users are using the product, or changes in the business short-term needs. These all are important and need to be addressed and solution. So what we have found works best, because we work agile, and that's the fastest way to get value to the users, is that the design sprint works 2 weeks ahead of the engineering sprint. This is a notional timeline that I'm showing on the screen, where we have the roadmap that feeds into the design sprint. It works so that the outcome from that could feed the engineering sprints that will come. The roadmap dictates what part of the work is taken. The design sprint output feeds the upcoming engineering sprint. We also need to think and bank time in our schedule for aiding the engineering sprint that is happening in the present. Also for small tasks that may arise and could not be foreseen or planned in the roadmap. I also want to show you how we organize the design work that worked best for us. This also worked best for the distributed teams that I obviously am a part of being here. It's very similar to a Kanban board. We have a to-do column, which is the backlog. Then there is an in progress column where all of the eyes are on, and a done by sprint time box column. I found that it's most useful to have the done column organized by sprints, because it's easier when the engineering team is planning and writing stories. Another useful column that I usually put in my Trello is the useful information column, where I put links to documentation, research findings, environments that I need to check. This is also very useful when we onboard new team members, especially product roles on the project, because they could just find all of the information that they need to read about when they have a task. They don't need to go into multiple tabs or have them bookmarked or just search them throughout a never-ending Google Drive. I usually link all of them in that column. Now, moving further away from design sprints, I want to give you examples of how exactly we do design for all of the different types of problems in a long-term engagement. We are now moving away from design sprints and towards applying design thinking mindset to the problems. The first one that we can see is this design thinking in small tasks. They are best tackled when you have all of the information. That's how you get them quickest done. We see that we could apply multiple steps from the design thinking mindset even into just 1 or 2 meetings. We could have a meeting with the main stakeholders or the decision makers and go through, emphasize, empathize, define, and ideate by asking questions like, who are we doing this for, why, what, and until when exactly. We go through the possible solutions, then we align on one, all in a couple of meetings. Then we could start potentially directly into high fidelity design because the solution is very clear. Again, I want to underline that these are very small tasks. It's clear all of the whys, all of the whats. We just needed the design so that it can aid into the building of the solution by the engineering team. We could test these designs by reviewing them with subject matter experts if the deadlines for these small tasks are very tight and you do not have time to plan and schedule and organize a user test. If the need for this small task is that the functionality, the solution needs to be in the user's hands as quickly as possible, then subject matter expert review is your best option to test. The next type of problem is the known problem. This is the best candidate for the short-term engagement design approach that George has defined earlier. I want to also showcase how the design thinking is applied here as well, and how the activities are substantially more than in the small tasks. The timeline for this is how George mentioned. It can range between 2 and 8 weeks. For a small task in comparison, that could be also done in a day or two. In the complex and undefined ones, this requires understanding and research alongside problem validation. This is the main difference. There are a lot of assumptions that go into one of these types of problems. You need to note them and you need to validate them. You need, in the define step, to define the goal. What does good look like? We could do a pre-mortem workshop to see what's roaring success and what does failure look like, so we can all be aligned in the same understanding. We could then ideate very high-level concepts and then go down into the details. So for the very high-level concepts could be information architecture. You could have the main flows ideated as diagrams. You could then take the outcome from the ideation and prototype it, even the high-level outcomes. You could do a tree test to test your information architecture. All of this design thinking will aid in splitting the work into smaller, approachable, more clear goals. And then you could redo the whole cycle again, and it will look more similar to the known problem one, the one that we saw before, sorry. I also want to share with you some helpful advice that is contextual to the long-term engagements. The two most important things that I found is organization and alignment. By how to organize, we can separate the design sprints from the engineering sprints. I personally saw that it works best, but it's very important that we plan ahead. We have the design sprint 2 weeks ahead of engineering. Equally important to have transparency. Make sure all of the people involved know and can find your design sprint planning, as well as all of your other deliverables. Apply design thinking to all of the problems you're solving with contextual timeframes in mind. So the small task could take a day or two. The known problem could span anywhere between 2, 8, even more weeks depending on the workload you already have. And then the big and complex ones could be broken down into epics and then into smaller tasks, and then it could populate months of roadmap. For alignment, as Jeff Gothelf talks in his book Lean UX about how Lean UX is collaborative, it's bringing designers and non-designers together for co-creation. The yield of ideas are bigger and better than if they were just done by individual contributors. In this way, everybody is involved and everybody gets to design, and that could happen in ideating workshops. And the awesome result from that is that everybody will be aligned. Some other points on how this alignment can be made is by planning. Make sure that your work is aligned with the latest understanding of the roadmap and priorities. So you align with the latest news. You have to have review and approval meetings that are set up in the stakeholder calendars so they know that potentially you have a day or 2 days a week, depending on your context and needs. And you have review and approve meetings. And everyone will make time for those because those are important. The user test results, it's paramount that you analyze the still present and also decide the action items collaboratively as a team. And another advice from me is over communicate with everyone, your engineering team, all the stakeholders in the cadence that is best suited for each. So it's not a one size fits all. I can't give you an advice that will be applicable for everyone. That's why you need to be flexible and design their experience of working with you as well. Now, the fun part of this training, we have the Q&A time. I see that we have some interesting questions. I would invite Georgie to maybe tell us his take on, of the design sprint participants, who's the customer?
That's a good question. I'm also trying to pull up the list of questions. What you type in appears on our screens. What a good question. So, of the design sprint participants, who's the customer? Now, I think design sprint as a practice is so productive, and feel free to chime in here. Maybe you'll bring something new to the table. But design sprint as a practice is so productive because you bring to the table actors, right, players that have different customers. So you would
could we see the slide where you went through who participates in a design sprint? I think that's useful, and I saw that the question came when you were on that slide. We can answer it in context.
Yes. So each participant would actually have a different kind, in mind. And if we're talking about the end user, that would be the designer, right? The one that the participant that advocates and will take decisions based on how will the user feel, what do they actually need, and so on. So you can say that almost each participant would have a certain client in mind. When you think about the business analyst, right? So the business analyst would sometimes either serve the interest of a really, let's say, a really important order that is the future roadmap, right? So they would spend a lot of time aligning people on what needs to get built first, and they would have it will sound weird, but they would usually have an agenda, and it's not I'm not saying this like under a negative aspect, but they would usually have a different list of priorities, and that's a really good thing, because the reason why we use the circle metaphor in here, because it's exactly that. It's a round table in which each participant has an input towards a final goal. Now, one thing to mention here is that even though people will have different priorities and different stakeholders or clients in mind, design sprint is not always the design by committee. So we shouldn't buy this fallacy in which design sprint becomes a voting mechanism, right? Because it's not the case. So it should be a really each participant should have a really well-defined role, and if there's a decision maker in the room, they should usually just have the final word towards either going on a specific solution or stop pursuing an alternate layout or approach, let's say, and so on.
Thank you. I also think a healthy debate on potential solutions, given that you have all of these roles at the table, is amazing, because the outcome from that is ultimately better. But as you said, Georgie, the decision maker, after they have all of the information and all of the input and all of the potential solutions explained and panned out, they could then have to make that decision. If the question was referring to the customer, meaning the client, we mostly call clients product owners, because the product owner is usually from the client side. So if the question was referring to who is the client with a big C, we work as one team. So for us, the client is the product owner.
Yes, that's true. We also have a really good question just next to this one. Did you want to add something to the first answer?
No, I think we can jump right into the next one.
Yeah, so here's another one. What's the point of starting a design when you don't have the requirements clearly defined? Or is this expected even in the first round? So first, what I would want to mention is that a design sprint can actually be applied for different problems and could actually have different outcomes. So sometimes the outcome of a design sprint is not an actual validated design. It could be very well be a validated set of requirements. So you could actually spend a week within a design sprint to make sure that you have a set of well-defined problems, and the prototyping and testing part, or sketching and then testing part of the design sprint, could be focused on making sure you understand the problem that you're solving for. As I said a couple of minutes ago, this is the most important thing, because we won't jump into the solutioning if we're not sure the problem is well defined. It's impossible to have a good solution for a problem that doesn't exist. I mean, you will be solving for nothing. And that's why defining the problem and making sure you have a really clear understanding on the requirements, like the product owner is also interested in solving this as quickly as possible, or I know that some of our user base is requesting this feature, but it doesn't quite make sense for us to tackle that because we need to get this refactoring done first, right? So
that's also why the second step in the design thinking mindset, on which design sprints are based, is a step called define, because we usually tackle things that are unknown and change a lot, and we need to change to adapt to certain situations. That's why the define step is after empathize. You then define the requirements, the problem, you align with everyone, and then you start ideating the solution, because anything before will lead to solutions based on assumptions, and solutions that are not solving for the right problem.
Yes. So I guess a key takeaway answering this question would be seeing a design sprint not necessarily as a way to do things faster, right? I know it's called a design sprint, but it doesn't mean things have to be done faster in order to get faster to some results, right? I think the key aspect here is getting something out the door, something that is smaller. So by solving small, you can actually get it out the door faster. But not design sprint wouldn't be defined as just doing all the design process, but just really fast.
We hope this all was very helpful, or at least entertaining. And thank you all for joining us on the last session of this training series.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a great one.
Thank you.
Bye.